Hey folks, stick around. We're going to talk about forward-facing sonar now that you finally got it. We're going to talk about 4 or 5 baits that work really well with forward-facing sonar. Hey, get ready to pre-fish tomorrow. I'm going to be using forward-facing sonar. The spawn is done, the fish are off the bank, no more post-spawn. Now it's a summer pattern, a straight-up summer pattern. And catching fish offshore, you might as well use the live scope or the forward-facing imaging that you've got to help you try to sharp shoot some fish. And so that's what I'm going to be doing the next couple of days. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the baits I use to help me do that. And one of the first ones that I use is a tube bait. I use a finesse tube bait from Get Bit Baits. I've got a couple of different colors, of different varieties, but they're the finesse style. Here's one in a leech color that I like to use. It's a finesse style. What I'll do with that particular bait, it's got a great size to mimic a crawfish on the bottom, but also a dying minnow in the water column. And I'll put a reaction tackle tungsten shroom jig on there, and I'll hook it stupid tube style with this, and I use the 110 size. And that 110 size in that finesse tube gives me a great rate of fall. I like the just fast enough for them to react to, but slow enough for me to be able to pick up when I pitch it out there in case I got to adjust my forward imaging to be able to see it. But it also allows those fish that are feeding up to track it. And when they are feeding up, they'll hit that thing before it even gets halfway down. So you can watch where the fish are positioned, where the cover is, throw over to it, watch it sink down, and you'll see the fish rise out of the cover to get it. The other one that works great for that is the all-time great bait, the Wacky Rig Senko. That's got a similar rate of fall. I can also use a tungsten weighted wacky rigged head for that as well. I got a bunch of different sizes of with a 1 wire guard on them, different size tungsten jigs from Reaction Tackle to help me with that rate of fall again. And the fish are going to tell us what rate of fall they want, but I like to start with that slower one. Once the fish start biting after the post spawn on summer fish, and they get the minnow bite going, and the more of the crayfish bite going after the middle of July, I like to use that bait. And then I start there, and I let them tell me if that rate of fall is too slow, if I need to speed it up based on their reaction. Another thing that I use to determine whether or not what bait I'm going to use for my forward facing is what the bottom composition is. If it's mucky and I'm using one of these tubes with one of these jig heads and it sinks down, or the Wacky Rig sinks down in the muck or the mud or the weeds, and it gets covered up full of material, the bottom material, or it sinks down in there and the fish can't track it, then I like to go to another rig. And when I go to this rig, I'll be fishing worms, but what I use is a component setup from Veribas, and I'll put those up on the screen. It's a through downshot leader, and it's a system of a through downshot leader, a hook with a swivel on it, and then a weight with a clip on it. And between those three components, the hook, the sinker, and these downshots, I'm able to present worms to them. And the key to that presentation is that whole rig's ability to stand up off the bottom. And I'll put an image up with the worm on it with that rig put together, how that thing is able to be pitched, and when it on a tight line, as you let that bait sink down to the bottom, you're following it on your sonar, and you see that thing land. With some of those other baits, they'll fall down and get lost in the bottom makeup. This thing will stand above it, and that worm will stand above it. And a lot of times that's the difference. When you have to hold that still and let that fish come down and see it, he sees that worm above the bottom, and a lot of times that's all it takes to trigger a strike, or just a shake to trigger a strike, whereas a shaky head might be down in that junk, or just a jig would be down in that bottom junk. This thing stands up above it. And then what I'll use are some worms that you would fish in a lot of different other situations, like the missile baits, robo worm in a 6-inch variety, the green pumpkin magic. That worm works really good That's the one I've got on the picture in the image of that setup. That's a great worm. If you need a curly tail worm, then I'll switch over to something like the Guggenbaits Mondo worm. It's got a curly tail on it, a little more movement on it. That's a great worm to use as well. And then one that people sleep on, that I think is just one of the all-time greats, is the OG Zoom finesse worm. And you can use green pumpkin chartreuse, June bug chartreuse, depending on the water clarity. But this is another deadly bait that you can use. The other thing, if you've got, depending on the conditions, is you can use some of the Z-Man worms as well. The Z-Man shaky head worms will actually stand up from that hook, from that setup, and really just kind of flutter there in their face. And a lot of times in the summertime, you've always heard that worms work in the summertime, so they're not going to be able to handle that thing wriggled in their face. So 3 baits that you can start with. And one thing I would emphasize is that you get out and practice with it. I really think it takes about 20 hours of staring at that forward-facing sonar in order to get good at it. If you think about it, if you've tried it, you've only got about a 20-degree cone as you get out there, and you can be 60 feet out at the end of your cast, where you need to be to stay away from those fish. Sometimes they'll let you get closer, they'll let you get to 35 feet, but a lot of times you got to be 40, 50 feet from those fish so the boat doesn't spook them off those spots if you're inside of 12 feet of water. And a lot of those good spots in the summertime start in 8 to 12 feet on that break, off of points, break lines, things like that. So in order to hit them, in order to hit those spots, in order to use the power head on your trolling motor, if your live transducer's on the shaft of your trolling motor and you're turning the head, on top you can look a little movement to those power heads. You can move the head a lot on the trolling motor, and you want to be precise about your movements. You also want to be able to position with the wind, right? So you want to get downwind of some of these spots so that you can turn around exactly downwind and hold the boat still in one place and point back at that spot, rather than get an angle to it. You're blowing and you're having to adjust. Things can get just difficult to aim. The greats, the pros that are being very successful with this, we watched them all spring. Some people who fish on weekends and fish in tournaments on weekends don't get the practice that they need to be proficient with it. The pros have all kinds of practice time on the water, where they're looking for isolated fish and isolated targets and throwing to them. And then when you get out there yourself and you're like, okay, I got all my equipment, I've got all the latest gear, I've scanned around, now I see that stump, it's as easy as just throwing something to it. All the other variables make it difficult. So get some practice time on it, and then once you're good and proficient with it and can stay off the fish, get to them and effectively fish them, maybe even with a couple of different baits so you can detect their mood, then you can start to develop a pattern and run a pattern that includes using your forward-facing sonar to chase fish down. And so spend some time with it. Like I said, I think it takes about 20 hours of doing it in close proximity to each other to actually become proficient with it, and then just keep expanding from there. But great baits to start with. Wacky Rig Senko, everybody's throwing it anyways. Great fish catching bait. They'll react to it. Got a great rate of fall. Reaction, my Get Bit Baits finesse tube with a reaction tackle head on it. And then that great setup that Veravas has got out there with the weights and the hooks and the leaders, in order to be able to switch lengths and switch weights without having to do a whole bunch of retying as you make adjustments to present to that fish. And then you can present a whole bunch of worms at them and really power up your drop shot game as you're going pitching to stumps and weed edges and heavy cover with a more adjustable system. So hope this helps. Please like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time on the water.